So for our show today, I want to start by, I guess, looking back at 2020. A lot of people have called the year a year of racial reckoning. And I think in many ways, that's a pretty accurate description. Over the summer, of course, we saw several high-profile instances of police violence. Those sparked mass nationwide protests, and the protests, I think, in turn, kind of generated this ongoing national discussion on the centrality of race and racism in the U.S. today. So I guess the question I, want to pose to you, Ariella and Paul, is to what extent is this racial reckoning actually something transformative? Because I think for me, a lot of the protests in the street do very much seem like a movement from below, right? But at the same time, over the summer, I personally was a little taken aback by how quickly the business sector, or like what we might call the investor class, rushed in to just immediately and enthusiastically embrace the racial reckoning. I think at this point, corporations, including Apple, Amazon, Uber, Microsoft, I think they've collectively donated something like over $2 billion to racial justice initiatives. Of course, tons of corporations are now pledging to diversify their boards, their C-suites, instituting anti-racism training for their workers. And then recently I saw that NASDAQ is talking about instituting a rule where if your company is listed on their exchange, it has to have two, quote, diverse directors, which they define as, anybody who's not a straight white male. So that's something that they're looking into. So I guess I on that note, I think that on the left, we're pretty used to looking at these types of corporate measures with a certain degree of skepticism, to put it mildly. But I want to quickly read a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who is, of course, the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, because I think it kind of speaks to how not everybody views these types of measures the same way. So the quote is... She says, so this was something that she said in the New York Times. She says, you basically have a moment where every corporation worth its salt is saying something about structural racism and anti-Blackness. And that stuff is even outdistancing what candidates in the Democratic Party were actually saying. So just thinking about the quote, I wanted to ask you guys, what do you make of this? And more specifically, does the recent corporate embrace of anti-racism signal some kind of sea change?
Yeah, that's a big question, Jen.
Yeah, starting off light.
Yeah. I think it's exactly the question that needs to be asked after this stuff, though, because these proposals and initiatives have gained so much momentum. And there have been some critiques about how cynical it is that some companies are trying to capitalize off of this moment where violence against Black people is gaining attention or racial inequality is gaining attention. But it's very different than the movements that you see in the street. And there's no one unifying factor around those demands. I would say that when you look at the protests, you have to understand them as site specific. The kind of oppression that people are reacting against is particular. The way that police violence fits into that oppression is particular. And what these corporate initiatives do is they put a veneer of similarity over the entire thing, right? And they say the demand that we're getting is representation. So we saw, high profile actors saying, I'm not going to voice a Black cartoon character. That's pretty far down my list of
urgent priorities.
Yeah, things that Black people really care about. But these are individuals struggling to figure out what they should do and what their role is in a time where racism has become collapsed into an individual critique. Mm-hmm. And what these corporate initiatives are doing is doubling down on it and also changing the scope of transformation to say, transformation is only what's within our power. So we can transform our workplace. We can transform our boards. None of us would say, don't hire people of color. That's not what we're advocating in criticizing this. And even insofar as they're making the boardroom more diverse, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what is bad is twofold. One, it's that it's taking this grassroots momentum, true, real rage that has fueled and sometimes pessimism and despair that's fueled these movements. And it's reorienting that to say, let's put a corporate friendly face on this, empower us to change the world. Retrenchment isn't the problem. Let's not talk about redistribution. We need think tanks to research the question of racism.
I think it's also interesting how a lot of these corporations are, it seems like now they're really comfortable using terms like systemic racism or structural racism, or as Kimberly Crenshaw says in her quote, even, talking about anti-Blackness. And I think on a certain level, that sounds radical, but it's also a way for corporations to be not very clear about what they're actually asking for, right? Like you can condemn systemic racism, but that doesn't mean you're going to raise wages for your workers.
Right. And I was going to say, I mean, my response to Crenshaw is it really outdistancing the Democratic Party candidates? Because from what I remember, most of the candidates did go through the motions and talked about structural racism. All of a sudden, everyone's talking about structural racism. I think this kind of points to the fact that if someone like Pete Buttigieg is talking about structural racism and Amazon and Walmart, it kind of points to how meaningless these gestures are becoming, and the left is getting very caught up in these gestures. And I think, always look at what are the corporations not putting their money into, and what are they doing it instead. And I mean, like you said, Walmart has fought a union for 20, 30 years relentlessly. Think about all the money they've spent on that. They're not going to give their workers a raise, but they are going to donate millions of dollars. And we really need to pause and think about what is this money going to? And there's definitely a political strategic reason they're putting their money there and not somewhere else, like into their workers. And I'll say something generally, Ariella, talking about these protests being site specific, and this might be kind of a bomb I'm just dropping in here, but I think we also need to take a step back, because from what I've seen locally, and I'm in Philadelphia, by the way, and nationally, from what it appears to me, I think these protests have been majority white, definitely not exclusively white. And we got to think about what that means. And I get a little uncomfortable with comparing this moment to the civil rights movement or comparing it to the urban riots. I think something kind of strange is happening. Maybe the first time we've seen a kind of ethnic politics being driven by white people on behalf of non-white people. And we got to think about what that means. And even thinking about it, it's not clear to me that even defund the police is popular, widespread among people of color. My head's not totally wrapped around this, but I think we really need to step back and consider what's going on here. This is not like the civil rights movement part 2. This is not the urban riots part 2. I think the way these corporations are getting involved signals that something else is going on here.
Yeah, I think the question of, who is the membership of the movement or who is the constituency of the movement is really important. And there does seem to be at a couple different levels a split between the people who are speaking for, the movement or for a certain cause and the people they claim to represent. And I think we also see this so recently, there's been a lot of talk about Biden's cabinet appointments, and there's been a lot in the news about who he's appointing and whether his cabinet is diverse enough. So, Ariella, I know that you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I want to pose a question to you guys. Would you rather, that's a fun game, right? Would you rather a bloated white supremacist deny you a stimulus check, or a diverse, beautiful United Colors of Benetton ad deny you a stimulus check?
Such a tough call.
This is,
I lay awake at night thinking of this, so this is very relevant.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate to me, the kind of bald tokenism that seems to be playing into so many of these decisions. And it goes beyond that, because the Congressional Black Caucus has a lot of power. They have a lot of sway, and they're pushing for certain people in Biden's cabinet. And they're saying we need Black representation. This is something that's not unfamiliar to anybody who listened to Kamala Harris when asked what she would bring to the administration, she's like, this was after she was like, I disavow socialism. Yeah, exactly. She was like, I will bring my personal experience as a woman of color, and that will inform my decisions and how I relate to this presidency. So I think there's something rhetorically happening there with the logic of liberalism that says if we have a change in the hearts and minds, or the standpoint theory position of an individual in power, we will see a more just outcome for people of a similar background. But we know that that's not the case. And Kamala's record makes that very clear. She's a successful, savvy politician who really championed some draconian policies that specifically affected people of color. And so Biden's administration is like an object lesson in multicultural neoliberalism. We've got a Raytheon board member. Can we bring up that graphic? Lloyd J. Austin III, board member of Raytheon Technologies, a defense contracting company, who needs to get a waiver in order to serve as Secretary of Defense. And there is some pushback. People are saying this is supposed to be a civilian in this position. This man has 41 years, I think, of military experience. But
he's diverse.
Yeah, and that's been the defense there. It's wild to me that the categories of race have become so collapsed, calcified, and then they're moved around like a chessboard. And it's also wild to me that this is still happening when it doesn't seem to have yielded as much success for the Democratic Party as they wanted it to.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, do you think that any working person of any race cares that the Office of Budget Management or whatever is filled by somebody who, quote, looks like them? Like, I just don't think that those are people's priorities. And it seems to me like the people or the groups that are advocating to fill those spots are always these groups like, with Lloyd Austin, it's the NAACP, right? And we have other groups, other racial advocacy groups who are pushing to fill cabinet spots with, whatever racial group they claim to represent. But I guess the question is like, do those groups represent actual people?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what else here, I don't know whether to call this like naive or out of touch, but there's been an established Black political class in this country for a long time. And many people, Black and white, have for a very long time, for generations, lived under representatives at all levels of the political, arena that are Black. So I think it's a little weird. I think a lot of people are kind of past this, like this idea that there's someone Black in politics is not blowing people's minds in large. And I think even the Obama experience, I mean, it was, in a way, it was kind of powerful in that sense, but it's just almost like they're acting like we're back at 1967 and we got the first Black mayor elected, and people's minds are going to be blown if there's Black people in the cabinet. And it seems kind of weirdly out of touch.
Oh, Paul, you cut off for a second, but I think it's absolutely true. We are being told to trade the expectation of real distributive political gains and economic gains, real economic justice, for a face that looks like yours. I don't fault people that think, I want to see somebody who looks like me be successful. I think that as an individual form of validation, that's apolitical, to be honest. But I do think that it becomes political when the political and corporate class tell you that's all you'll get. You can live in decrepit public housing in the richest country in the world, but a Black woman will be running HUD.
Right.
One with no experience in housing whatsoever, by the way.
Right. Yeah, there's that element. And I think a flip side to that is when you see these neoliberal interests try to claim that policies that are actually very bad for working people of all races are some sort of like racial justice initiatives. And I think that's becoming more and more common. So one example I wanted to look at in regards to this, it comes out of California. You guys probably remember for the last election, there was a ballot measure, Proposition 22 in California, which was a ballot measure that sought to reclassify gig workers, so like Uber drivers, Instacart shoppers, and other app-based workers. The ballot measure was to reclassify them as independent contractors, which obviously, is a move that would undermine some pretty serious labor protections for those workers, including minimum wage and overtime,
unemployment benefits.
Exactly, unemployment in many cases, and collective bargaining. So this is just like a categorically bad policy. And of course, Silicon Valley pours $200 million, maybe more, into this ballot measure in order to pass it. And it did pass. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of this was you actually saw certain racial advocacy groups endorsing Proposition 22. So California's NAACP chapter endorsed, a Latino advocacy group called Si Se Puede Foundation endorsed Prop 22, and so did a branch of Al Sharpton's National Action Network. And I want to look specifically at California's NAACP, which is was led by this woman, Alice Huffman, who also runs a PR consulting firm, which accepted money from, the Yes on Prop 22 campaign to kind of campaign for the proposition and do PR for it. And the reason why I think this example is really interesting is because she specifically framed her support and the NAACP's support for Proposition 22 as a racial justice measure. So, she, as part of her kind of PR work, what she did is she wrote a lot of op-eds. There's one where she was featured in a lot of ads. She ran an op-ed titled "Why Communities of Color Support Proposition 22," and she basically was like, Proposition 22 is good for Black and brown workers. So I'm going to read a quote from another one of her op-eds. She writes about Proposition 22: "It's a win-win that will save hundreds of thousands of jobs for Black and brown workers and for all Californians who are choosing independent app-based work." So we basically just talked about how, Proposition 22 is a disaster for workers. It probably won't surprise anybody that the majority of these gig workers in California are actually not people who are white, right? So this, in a way, is the furthest thing I can possibly imagine from a racial justice measure. But I think this example sort of speaks to how easy it is to use that language to serve your needs, and how adept, as Paul, you say, the kind of like professional strata of these like race relations managers, how adept they are at using that language.
Yeah, and I think, there's a strategic question here. Uber and Lyft can't fake, if the demand is a union and a certain wage and benefits, they can't fake it. But if we center other things like a vague call for diversity, that's something they can fake or even actually institute very well. So, and this, this is important. Again, to me, it's not just an academic point, but from an organizer standpoint, it's like, what are we framing? And, how are we framing this fight? And what is a better terrain for us? Because Uber and Lyft can't talk their way or fake their way out of, you're either paying your workers a certain amount or you're not. They either have a union or not. When it comes to diversity, they are very skilled, and I think are becoming more skilled at faking it.
Mm-hmm. So I think, as I was saying earlier, like I think lots of people on the left sort of understand that corporations at this point will like do these dirty tricks and kind of play these games and are really good at sort of commandeering this rhetoric. But I want to look at the academy and at NGOs for a second, because Paul, I know that you had some comments on the Center for Anti-Racism. So take it away.
So Jack Dorsey, who's the co-founder of Twitter, he donated $10 million to the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. And that is associated with, speaking of cabinet positions, I think Ibram Kendi X is running for race czar. That's what I think he's trying to do here. He's a thinker on so-called anti-racism. So, it says of the total gift, $9 million is going to go to their endowment. 1 million will be available for immediate use. And so, my first question is like, what the hell is anti-racist research? Like what is it? And how much more research do we really need to do? Like, we know there's massive inequality and disparities in healthcare, education, and income. And right now we need a political solution to this disparity. It's not a matter of doing more research. And I'll put up a certain quote here, because this is not just about revolutionizing research, but if Kennedy seeks to revolutionize academia's approach to studying racism, Dorsey wants to revolutionize how billionaires give away their money. In April, he announced the creation of Start Small with the aim of funding global COVID-19 relief, girls' health and education, efforts towards a universal basic income, and most recently, social justice reform. And so, I mean, one thing here is notice what he aims to fund. You know, COVID-19 relief could mean anything. Girls' health and education is vague. Increasingly today, when you say social justice, you're talking about just criminal justice reform. And just notice, you know, he's not going to put money into Medicare for all or a job guarantee or free higher education. And, you know, Jane McAleese has made this point a lot recently, that all liberals ever do is kind of create commissions to study the same problem over and over again and never offer a solution. And this really seems like that same kind of liberal approach. And it's like research by tech giants is not going to get us anywhere. You know, we know that Medicare for all will help end health disparities. We know that taxing the rich will increase funding for public service. We know that unions will increase wages for workers, especially Black workers. So right now, what we need is a political struggle to win these things. So maybe that money would be better well spent, you know, in political lobbying. Or why isn't he donating to a down ballot candidate that is really, you know, championing these causes? And we know the Twitter founders of the world are never going to donate to the Bernies of the world.
Yeah, I also want to point out that I read somewhere recently that Twitter's revenue last quarter was literally over 900 million. So like donating 10 million, I mean, like, I'll take it, but like, it's kind of a drop in the bucket for, you know, the Silicon Valley overlords, you know?
I will 50 cents to that.
Right.
And I solved it. Don't make people independent contractors so they'll be able to have access to healthcare.
Right.
Ta-da! Give me $10 million.
Oh, also one last point is, you know, you don't really need a commission or like a center, like an academic center for Medicare for all or raising the minimum wage. I mean, obviously there's like a ton of research you can do in that area, and like people do work on, of course, labor and healthcare. But I kind of feel like that's the difference between a policy demand and, you know, I guess call for more research or like a center or like an NGO.
Yeah, I think
it's like solving racism through lab coats.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Why are these people so upset? It's not like we have, you know, the written word of hundreds of people who've experienced this.
Now, Ariella, I think we have to study this for a couple more decades, and I'm also going to need 10 million.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, too, that billionaires are throwing their weight behind UBI. Andrew Yang has done a UBI pilot that actually our upcoming guest, David Kelnitz, calls really slow lottery, because it's a very small amount of money. He's like, that's not really an income necessarily. Yeah. But they are looking at these, and, you know, we can have a serious debate about this another time about what UBI does and what its role is. But it's very, very telling that this portion of the political class is donating to research that or fund it in the same breath as the kind of hollowed out cries for reform around race or gender.
Right.
It's, yeah.